The message they were certain you would send never came. And maybe that is exactly where you are right now. Sitting inside a silence that feels heavier than any conversation you ever had with them. They pulled away again. Their replies became shorter. Their warmth disappeared. Something that once felt close suddenly became distant, and you were left trying to understand how someone could change so quickly. But this time, something else changed too. You did not chase them. You did not send the long message. You did not ask whether everything was okay. You did not create another reason to reopen the conversation. You simply stopped, and somewhere on the other side of that silence, they may still be expecting the version of you they remember. The version who always came back. Because that was the pattern. They created distance and you tried to close it. They became quiet and you became louder with your love. They stepped backward and you stepped forward. Maybe you told yourself you were only checking on them. Maybe you wanted clarity. Maybe you wanted to prevent something meaningful from falling apart over a misunderstanding. So you reached out again and again. And every time you did, something subtle happened. The silence ended before either of you had to fully understand what that silence meant. They never had to sit inside your absence for very long because you kept arriving before absence could become real. But this time the expected message is missing. At first that may mean very little to them. One day passes, then another. They may assume you are upset. They may think you need some time. They may even feel comfortable with the distance. This is important to understand because people with avoidant attachment tendencies can sometimes respond to emotional pressure by creating space. Distance can temporarily reduce the intensity they feel around closeness. So while you are wondering whether they notice your absence, they may initially appear perfectly fine. And here is the shocking part. Your silence may feel like relief to them before it ever feels like loss. That sentence can hurt, especially if you spent days hoping they were staring at their phone, fighting the urge to contact you. But understanding this can free you from one of the most painful mistakes people make after an avoidant pulls away. You cannot measure your value by somebody else's immediate reaction to losing access to you. Some people feel separation immediately. Others process it much later. Some distract themselves. Some rationalize. Some suppress. And some never process it in the way you hoped they would. But time does something that the first few days of silence cannot. It removes certainty. Because there is a massive emotional difference between thinking, they are quiet right now, and slowly realizing they may actually be done reaching for me. That is where this becomes deeper than no contact, deeper than waiting for a text, deeper than wondering who misses whom more. Because eventually the question is no longer simply whether they notice your silence. The question becomes whether they notice that the person who always restored the connection is no longer performing that role. And more importantly, why did you always have to perform it? Stay with me because before we get to what may happen when your absence finally becomes real to them, there is something even more important you need to see. Once you understand it, you may never look at their silence or your own the same way again. There is a reason you may feel almost physically pulled toward your phone. There is a reason your mind creates perfectly reasonable excuses to contact them. You remember something you forgot to tell them. You wonder whether they are okay. You think one call message could fix everything. Your mind tells you that you are not chasing. You are simply communicating like an adult. Yet beneath all those explanations can be something much more vulnerable. You want the uncertainty to end. For a long time, reaching out may have been how you ended it. Even a cold reply gave you something. Even a disappointing conversation removed the unbearable emptiness of not knowing. Contact gave your nervous system information. Silence gave it questions. So it kept choosing information, even when that information hurt. Now you are doing something different. You are allowing the unanswered question to remain unanswered. And that is why your silence can feel so uncomfortable. You are not only separating from another person, you may be interrupting a pattern inside yourself. That distinction matters because this is not going to be a lesson about using silence as a weapon. This is not about disappearing so perfectly that another person becomes desperate for you. Silence used to punish, control, or provoke someone is still another form of attachment to their reaction. You are still emotionally standing at their door. You have simply stopped knocking. Real silence begins somewhere else. It begins when you stop asking, "Is this making them miss me?" and slowly start asking, "Why was I willing to lose so much of myself just to keep this connection alive?" And that question changes everything. Because they may reach out, they may not. They may miss you quietly. They may distract themselves. They may feel relief first and loss later. They may return with a casual message as though nothing happened. But none of those possibilities are the deepest part of this story. The deepest part is what happens when the old version of you stops returning on command. Throughout this video, you are going to understand why an avoidant may expect you to break the silence, why your absence can initially create relief instead of panic, why emotions can sometimes surface later, and how to tell the difference between somebody genuinely returning and somebody simply checking whether they still have access to you. But most importantly, you are going to understand why the greatest transformation may have nothing to do with what happens inside them. Because perhaps this silence was never meant to make them recognize your value. Perhaps it was meant to become quiet enough for you to recognize it. The real change does not begin when they miss you. It begins when they realize the old version of you may no longer be available. And by the time that realization arrives, something unexpected may already be happening inside you. Welcome to the channel. If you are trying to understand attachment, healing, relationships, and the deeper lessons hidden inside the moments that change us, subscribe and stay with me. Because the silence experience right now may not be the end of your story. It may be the first moment you finally stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else close. There is a reason they expected you to break the silence, and it may have far less to do with arrogance than you think. They expected it because the relationship had quietly taught them what happened whenever distance appeared. They moved away. You felt the distance. You reached toward them. The connection restarted. Nobody sat down and signed an agreement saying this was how things would work. Nobody announced the pattern. It simply repeated until repetition started feeling like certainty. And once a pattern becomes familiar enough, both people can begin participating in it before they even realize what they are doing. Think about the last few times they became distant. Maybe their replies became shorter. Maybe affection suddenly disappeared. Maybe a conversation that once flowed naturally started feeling forced. You noticed immediately. Your body probably noticed before your mind could explain it. Something felt different. You checked your phone more often. You replayed the last conversation. You searched for the moment when the energy changed. Then the questions began. Did I say something wrong? Are they losing interest? Are they talking to someone else? Should I give them space? Should I ask directly? Should I wait? And while your mind was trying to solve the mystery, another part of you wanted only one thing: restore the connection. So eventually, you reached out. Maybe you sent something simple. Maybe you asked how they were doing. Maybe you found a harmless reason to start talking again. Maybe you sent something funny because being vulnerable felt too risky. Maybe you wrote a long message explaining your feelings carefully enough that they could not possibly misunderstand you. And for a moment, something happened. The pressure inside you dropped. You had acted. You were no longer simply waiting. This is where the pattern becomes important. For someone who becomes more anxious when connection feels threatened, action can feel safer than uncertainty. When the relationship feels unstable, the nervous system may push toward closeness, more contact, more reassurance, more answers, more signs that the bond is still alive. Attachment researchers often describe this general tendency as hyperactivation. That word sounds complicated, but the experience is painfully simple. Something feels wrong, so your system says, get closer, find out, repair it, do something before you lose them. For someone with stronger avoidant tendencies, the same emotional pressure can produce almost the opposite response. Their system may say, create space, reduce the intensity, do not depend too much, do not expose too much, get yourself under control. Instead of moving toward the relationship when overwhelmed, they may move away from it. Researchers often describe strategies like these as deactivation. Again, the technical language sounds colder than the human experience. At its core, it can simply mean that closeness begins to feel emotionally demanding, so distance becomes a way to regulate that discomfort. Now notice what happens when these two responses meet. One person becomes afraid of losing connection and moves closer. The other becomes overwhelmed by emotional intensity and moves farther away. The first person experiences the distance as evidence that something is wrong, so they move closer again. The second experiences that increased pursuit as more pressure, so they create even more distance. Suddenly, both people are reacting to each other's reactions, and eventually, neither person is responding to the relationship as it actually is. They are responding to what their nervous system fears the relationship might become. Do not skip this part, because this is where many people accidentally turn attachment language into blame. The anxious person is not automatically needy. The avoidant person is not automatically cruel. These patterns exist on spectrums. People are more complicated than labels, and not every distant person has an avoidant attachment style. Sometimes somebody is simply uninterested. Sometimes they are emotionally unavailable for reasons unrelated to attachment. Sometimes a relationship is unhealthy. Sometimes two people simply want different things. But when a pursue and withdraw pattern really is present, understanding it can explain why the same painful sequence seems to happen again and again. You were not necessarily sitting there consciously deciding, I will chase this person. They were not necessarily sitting there consciously deciding, I will make this person anxious. Often, something faster was happening. Your discomfort activated your familiar strategy. Their discomfort activated theirs. And each strategy accidentally strengthened the other. That is the lesser-known part. Some reactions that look completely deliberate from the outside can begin as automatic emotion regulation strategies. Research into attachment suggests that avoidance can involve suppression, distancing, and reduced proximity seeking, while attachment anxiety can involve intensified attention toward threats to the relationship and stronger attempts to restore closeness. In ordinary language, one person may feel safer by closing the distance, while another may feel safer by increasing it, and both can believe they are simply doing what makes sense. You think, if we care about each other, we should talk about this. They think, if this becomes too intense, I need time to myself. You think, why are you running away from a conversation that could fix this? They think, why can I not have space without this becoming another emotional conversation? You interpret their distance as rejection. They may interpret your pursuit as pressure. You increase contact because you feel unsafe. They increase distance because they feel unsafe. And suddenly two people who may genuinely care about each other are each trying to feel safer in ways that make the other person feel less safe. That is why these dynamics can become so exhausting. The relationship begins teaching both people their roles. You become the repairer. They become the withdrawer. You become the one who notices the emotional temperature. They become the one who decides when closeness becomes too much. You become the one asking where things stand. They become the one asking why everything needs to be discussed. And after enough repetitions, something subtle happens. The pattern starts replacing choice. You stop asking whether you should reach out and start feeling that you have to. They stop wondering whether you will return and begin assuming you probably will. This is why your current silence may feel so different. You are not merely withholding a message, you are interrupting a prediction, and the human mind loves predictions. We use previous experience to anticipate what happens next. If someone has behaved similarly 10 times, we naturally expect something similar the 11th time. Relationships are full of these tiny predictions. You know how someone sounds when they are irritated. You know whether they usually call after an argument. You know how long they normally need before they calm down. You know which person apologizes first. You know which person breaks an awkward silence. Over time, these expectations become part of the relationship itself. So when they withdrew before, perhaps they already knew something without consciously putting it into words. You would eventually return, maybe not immediately. Maybe after a few days. Maybe after you became frustrated enough. Maybe after loneliness became stronger than pride. But eventually your name would appear on their screen, and each time that happened, the cycle received another piece of evidence. Distance does not mean the connection is actually ending, because you will restore it. Here is the truth that can be painful to admit. Sometimes the person who keeps rescuing a connection from silence prevents both people from discovering whether that connection can survive without being rescued. Read that emotionally, not as an accusation. You were trying to protect something you cared about. You were trying to communicate. You were trying not to lose someone important. You may even have believed that mature love meant being the person willing to put ego aside and reach out first. And sometimes it does. Healthy relationships absolutely require repair. Someone has to speak. Someone has to soften. Someone has to say, I do not want us to stay disconnected. The problem begins when repair becomes one person's permanent responsibility. Because then you are no longer simply repairing occasional ruptures. You are maintaining the entire emotional bridge. And bridges become exhausting when only one person keeps rebuilding them. Maybe this is why you are tired now, not angry, not even completely heartbroken anymore, just tired, tired of decoding silence, tired of wondering whether giving space means 3 hours, 3 days, or 3 weeks, tired of trying to find the perfect words that express your needs without making them withdraw, tired of pretending you need less because asking for more seems dangerous, tired of being told through behavior that your desire for clarity is somehow too much. Tired of being the one who understands everyone while quietly wondering who is trying to understand you. There comes a moment when the body becomes exhausted from participating in a pattern the mind keeps defending. And maybe your silence began there, not with some grand decision, not with revenge, not with a strategy, just exhaustion. You looked at the phone and realized you had nothing left to explain. You had already explained. You had already tried softness. You had already tried patience. You had already tried giving space. You had already tried reaching out. You had already tried not reaching out for a while, and then eventually reaching out anyway. And something inside you quietly asked a question you had avoided for too long. Why am I always the one trying to bring this back to life? That question can hurt because it threatens the story you used to survive the relationship. Maybe you told yourself they were simply scared. Maybe they had been hurt before. Maybe they needed more time. Maybe they cared deeply but struggled to express it. Maybe you saw tenderness underneath their distance, and perhaps that tenderness was real. But compassion becomes dangerous when it requires you to continuously abandon your own emotional reality. Understanding why somebody withdraws does not obligate you to chase them. Knowing that somebody has wounds does not make you responsible for becoming the medicine. And loving somebody does not automatically mean you are meant to keep proving that love whenever they create distance. This is where painful clarity begins, because perhaps they expected you to reach out, partly because you had taught them that you would, not through words, through repetition. Every time they disappeared and you restored connection, the relationship learned something. Every time they avoided the uncomfortable conversation and you later accepted normal conversation without addressing what happened, the relationship learned something. Every time you lowered a boundary because losing them frightened you, the relationship learned something. Every time you accepted ambiguity because a little connection felt better than no connection, the relationship learned something. And this does not mean you caused their behavior. It means you participated in a system. There is a difference. Blame says, this happened because of you. Awareness says, this pattern included you, which means part of your power lies in changing your participation. That is a far more hopeful truth, because you cannot control whether another person becomes more emotionally available. You cannot force them to communicate. You cannot force insight. You cannot force accountability. You cannot force someone to recognize the effect their distance has on you. But you can stop performing the role that keeps you trapped. And sometimes one changed role is enough to expose the entire pattern. The moment the pursuer stops pursuing, the old dance no longer works the same way. That does not guarantee the other person suddenly becomes secure. It does not guarantee they return. It does not guarantee regret. It simply means the familiar sequence has been interrupted. They retreat. But this time you do not follow. The space remains. And now both people must experience something they were previously protected from. You must experience uncertainty without immediately reaching for reassurance. They must experience distance without automatically receiving your pursuit. That is why this moment can feel almost unbearable for you. Your silence may look peaceful from the outside while feeling like chaos inside. You may wake up determined not to contact them and feel completely different by evening. You may write messages and delete them. You may open their profile and close it. You may hear a song and suddenly feel every memory at once. You may tell yourself you are done, then 5 minutes later wonder whether one honest conversation could still save everything. That does not mean your boundary is fake. It means you are learning how to tolerate a feeling that you used to resolve through contact. There is a difference between wanting to reach out and needing to obey that urge. That difference is where emotional freedom starts growing. At first, it may be tiny. 10 minutes without checking, one evening without sending anything, one morning where you do not begin your day by wondering whether they are thinking about you. Then slowly, something changes. You discover that discomfort rises and falls. An urge is not an instruction. Loneliness is not always a sign that you chose incorrectly. Missing someone is not evidence that you belong with them, and silence does not automatically mean you must repair something. Sometimes silence reveals what constant repair was hiding. That is why the unfinished loop matters. Before their withdrawal triggered your pursuit eventually created some form of reconnection. Reconnection reduced your anxiety. Distance reduced their pressure. Both nervous systems received temporary relief, but the underlying problem remained untouched. Nobody learned how to create secure closeness. Nobody learned how to stay present during discomfort. Nobody learned how to communicate needs before reaching the point of withdrawal or panic. The cycle merely reset. Then the next trigger came, and everything started again. This is why some relationships can feel intensely emotional without actually becoming deeply intimate. Intensity and intimacy are not the same thing. Read that again inside yourself. Intensity and intimacy are not the same thing. A relationship can contain longing, chemistry, sleepless nights, dramatic reunions, powerful attraction, painful separations, and enormous emotional highs, without containing the consistency required for secure intimacy. Sometimes the very instability that hurts you also makes the connection feel unusually powerful, because uncertainty keeps your attention locked onto it. You are always waiting for the next shift, the next message, the next warm moment, the next withdrawal, the next reunion. Your emotional system never gets to fully rest. And when relief finally arrives, it can feel almost euphoric. They respond warmly after days of distance. Suddenly you can breathe again. They say they missed you. Your entire body softens. They become affectionate. The pain of the previous week seems less important. You think, there it is. This is the person I knew was still there. And because the relief is so powerful, you may mistake the ending of anxiety for proof of extraordinary love. Here is the pattern interrupt you may need to hear. The strongest feeling is not always the deepest truth. Sometimes the strongest feeling is simply relief. Sometimes the moment that feels like destiny is your nervous system celebrating because uncertainty temporarily stopped. That does not make your love fake. It means love and nervous system activation can become tangled together, and separating them requires courage. Because once you begin separating them, you may notice things you previously did not want to see. You may notice that you spent more time waiting for connection than enjoying connection. You may notice that the relationship felt safest when you expected the least. You may notice that you celebrated basic consistency because inconsistency had lowered your expectations. You may notice that a simple message felt enormous because silence had made you hungry for anything. You may notice that you called emotional unpredictability depth because accepting the alternative was too painful. And maybe you are beginning to understand why your silence is not really about them. Not yet. Right now, it is about breaking your automatic side of the cycle. Because if you reach out only to remove your anxiety, you may receive temporary relief while restarting the exact pattern that created the anxiety. That is the trap. The message feels like the solution because sending it reduces uncertainty. But reducing uncertainty is not the same as solving the relationship. You can know where you stand for one evening and still wake up inside the same pattern tomorrow. You can receive an affectionate reply and still have no answer to the deeper question. Can this person meet me consistently? Can we discuss difficult things without one person disappearing and the other person panicking? Can both of us have needs without treating those needs as threats? Can closeness exist without someone feeling trapped? Can space exist without someone feeling abandoned? Can we repair conflict without repeating the same roles? Those questions matter more than whether they reply tonight. And that is painful because your heart wants something immediate. It wants the notification. It wants the familiar name. It wants to know you mattered. It wants one sentence that makes the last week feel less unbearable. But your deeper self may be asking for something different now. Not evidence that they still care. Evidence that you can care about yourself even when they are unavailable. That is a much harder form of reassurance. Nobody sends it to you. You build it, slowly, quietly, one decision at a time. This is where something almost spiritual begins happening inside the silence. You start noticing how much of your emotional life had become organized around another person's availability. When they were warm, you felt safe. When they were distant, you questioned yourself. When they responded quickly, the day felt lighter. When they disappeared, everything felt heavier. Their behavior became the weather inside your inner world. And because you could not control their behavior, you could not control your own emotional climate. That is a painful way to live. You may have called it love because love was certainly present, but love was not the only thing present. Fear was there too, hope was there, attachment was there, old wounds may have been there, the desire to finally be chosen by someone difficult to reach may have been there. And sometimes we become so focused on understanding why another person cannot stay close that we never ask why we are working so hard to remain close to someone who repeatedly makes us feel alone. That question is not meant to shame you, it is meant to bring you home. Maybe you stayed because there were beautiful moments. Maybe when they opened up, they showed you a side of themselves almost nobody else saw. Maybe they told you things they rarely told anyone. Maybe there were nights when the connection felt almost sacred. Maybe they looked at you in a way that made you believe there was something beneath all that distance worth waiting for. Maybe there was. Human beings are complicated. Someone can care for you and still be unable to create a healthy relationship with you. Someone can feel deeply and still communicate poorly. Someone can be wounded without being ready to heal. Someone can want you and still repeatedly push you away. Those truths can exist together. That is why letting go of the chase is so difficult. If they were completely terrible, leaving would be easier. If there had been nothing real, you would not still be thinking about them. The hardest connections to release are often the ones that contained enough beauty to keep hope alive, but not enough consistency to let your heart rest. You kept waiting for the beautiful version to become the permanent version. Maybe you believed enough patience would make that happen. Maybe they believed you would always be patient enough to wait. And now, for the first time, neither assumption is being protected. The silence remains. Do not skip this part, because there is another mistake people make when they learn about avoidant attachment. They begin using psychology to predict the other person's every move. They watch videos trying to calculate when the avoidant will miss them. Day 7, day 14, day 30. They search for signs. They interpret social media posts. They wonder whether a new profile photo means anything. They treat attachment theory like a secret code that will reveal exactly when the other person returns. But human beings are not equations. Attachment theory can help explain tendencies. It cannot tell you exactly what one specific person is thinking at 11:43 at night. It cannot promise they miss you. It cannot promise they will return. And it cannot turn silence into a guaranteed strategy. If somebody tells you that every avoidant will panic after a specific number of days, be careful. Real emotional life is more complicated. Some people return, some do not. Some miss you but remain silent. Some reach out because they are lonely. Some reach out because they genuinely reflected. Some reach out because they want reassurance that you are still available. Some move forward. Some come back and repeat exactly what happened before. The purpose of understanding the pattern is not to predict them perfectly. It is to stop losing yourself while trying. That is the shift. You stop asking, when will their nervous system activate? And you start asking, why has mine been living on alert? You stop asking, when will they understand what they lost? And you start asking, when did I start believing I had to be lost before someone could appreciate me? You stop asking, how long should I stay silent to create the strongest effect? And you start asking, what would I do if their reaction were no longer the center of my decision? That question changes the meaning of silence. Because silence created as a tactic is still focused on them. You are quiet, but watching. You are absent, but waiting. You are not messaging, but mentally composing the message. You are not pursuing with your hands, but you are pursuing with your thoughts. Every day becomes another experiment. Did they notice yet? Do they care yet? Are they scared yet? Will they come back now? That is not freedom. That is chasing without movement. Real change begins when the silence stops being a performance. You are not trying to teach them a lesson. You are learning one yourself. You are learning that another person's distance does not require you to run after them. You are learning that love cannot be sustained by one person's emotional labor. You are learning that uncertainty is uncomfortable but survivable. You are learning that you can miss somebody without reopening a door that repeatedly injured you. You are learning that your desire for connection is not something to be ashamed of. And you are learning that connection worth having should not require you to repeatedly betray your own need for stability. This is painful clarity, because clarity does not always arrive as relief. Sometimes clarity hurts before it heals. It removes excuses. It exposes patterns. It forces you to look at things exactly as they are instead of only as they could become. Potential can keep a person emotionally attached for years. You remember their best moments and build a future from them. You see flashes of vulnerability and assume deeper availability is just around the corner. You receive one sincere apology and hope everything has changed. But a relationship cannot live permanently inside potential. Eventually, behavior has to meet possibility. And maybe that is what your silence is finally allowing you to observe. Not what they could become, not what they said they wanted, not what you believe exists beneath their defenses. What is actually happening? When there is discomfort, do they communicate? When you express a need, do they remain present? When conflict appears, can they work through it? When intimacy deepens, do they become more honest or more distant? When they hurt you, can they acknowledge it without turning your pain into an accusation against them? When you stop doing all the emotional work, does the relationship still move? These are uncomfortable questions, but they reveal something waiting could never reveal. You may discover that your pursuit was carrying more of the connection than you realized. And if that is true, the silence will expose it. Not immediately, but eventually, because a relationship that only moves when you push it is giving you information. A connection that only repairs when you repair it is giving you information. A person who only becomes emotionally available when they fear losing you is giving you information. Information is not always the answer you wanted, but it can become the answer that frees you. And somewhere in this process, something strange begins happening. The urge to contact them may still come, but another voice appears beside it. A quieter voice. It says, wait. Not because you are playing a game, not because you want them to suffer, because you have already seen what happens when fear makes the decision. Fear sends the message. Fear accepts the crumb. Fear explains too much. Fear negotiates boundaries. Fear says, maybe this time. Fear says, I cannot lose them. But self-respect asks a different question. What happens if I stop losing myself? That question may be the beginning of everything, because for the first time, the loop remains unfinished. They moved away. Your nervous system noticed. Your mind produced all the old questions. Your body wanted relief. Your fingers may have wanted to type, but you did not automatically complete the pattern. There is now an empty space where your pursuit used to be. And empty spaces reveal things. They reveal whether someone comes toward you without being pulled. They reveal whether a connection has momentum beyond your effort. They reveal whether you can tolerate uncertainty without abandoning yourself. They reveal how much of the relationship was mutual and how much was maintained by your fear of losing it. Most importantly, they give both nervous systems a new experience. For yours, the experience is this. Distance can happen, and I do not have to immediately fix it. That may sound small. It is not. If your system learned over years that disconnection means danger, sitting inside uncertainty without chasing can feel deeply uncomfortable. But every time you survive that discomfort without abandoning your values, you begin proving something to yourself. I can feel this without obeying it. I can miss them without contacting them. I can love someone without taking responsibility for their willingness to participate. I can want connection without begging for access to it. I can survive not knowing. That is how a pattern begins losing its power. Not because the feeling disappears, because the feeling stops controlling every decision. And on the other side of the dynamic, something different is happening too. Their familiar sequence has also been interrupted. The distance they created is no longer followed by the response they knew. No message, no emotional check-in, no carefully constructed excuse to restart conversation, no reassurance that you remain exactly where they left you. At first, they may not interpret this dramatically at all. That matters, because the fantasy that an avoidant instantly collapses the moment you stop reaching out can keep you trapped in another kind of waiting. Sometimes the opposite happens first. The pressure disappears, the emotional conversation is gone, the expectation to respond is gone. The relationship suddenly asks nothing from them. And for someone whose habitual response to emotional intensity is distance, that space can initially feel easier. Yes, easier. This is the part that may hurt. You may be suffering through the silence while they seem lighter. You may be checking the clock while they appear busy with work. You may be wondering how they can function normally while you are carrying the weight of everything that happened. You may see them laughing, posting, going out, working, living, and your mind may immediately turn their apparent calm into a verdict about your worth. They are fine without me. They never cared. I was the only one who felt anything. Maybe I meant nothing. Be careful there. Visible behavior does not give you complete access to another person's internal world. But equally important, do not swing to the opposite fantasy and tell yourself that every smile is fake and they are secretly devastated. You do not know. And freedom begins when you stop needing to know every detail of what is happening inside them. Still, there is something useful psychology can teach us about avoidant coping. Some people regulate emotional threat partly by directing attention away from attachment-related cues. One fascinating line of research has even examined this through eye movements. In threat-related contexts, people higher in attachment avoidance have shown tendencies consistent with turning attention away from cues of care and closeness. Think about how subtle that is. Avoidance does not always begin with a fully conscious sentence such as, "I refuse to feel this." Sometimes attention itself can shift. The mind reduces contact with the very cues that might activate attachment. That is the surprising fact most people never hear. A person can sometimes distance not only through behavior, but through what their attention allows them to stay with. That does not mean they are secretly suffering. It does not prove love. It does not excuse hurtful behavior. It simply helps explain why two people can experience the same separation in dramatically different ways. You may move toward the emotional meaning. They may move away from it. You replay conversations. They fill the schedule. You look at old photographs. They focus on tasks. You want to understand every feeling. They may prefer not to touch the feeling at all. You experience the loss in the foreground. They may push it into the background. And because you are comparing your internal experience with their external behavior, you assume the difference means you cared more. Sometimes it might, but sometimes it means you process distress differently. That distinction matters. Here is another pattern interrupt. Calm is not proof of indifference, and pain is not proof of love. A person can look calm because they are regulated. They can look calm because they are suppressing. They can look calm because they genuinely moved on. They can look calm because the emotional consequences have not arrived yet. You cannot diagnose the truth from a social media story, and you should not build your healing around trying. This is where your heart may resist. Because uncertainty feels cruel. You want an answer. Did they love me? Do they miss me? Are they thinking about me? Does the silence hurt them too? Those questions feel like they are about them. But often there is another question underneath. Was I significant? You want their pain to prove your significance. You want their return to prove your worth. You want their regret to rewrite the rejection. That is deeply human. But it is also a dangerous place to build your identity, because then your healing depends on another person's emotional reaction. If they suffer, you mattered. If they return, you were valuable. If they apologize, your pain becomes legitimate. If they never return, you start questioning everything. Your value cannot live inside that equation. You were significant because you were present sincerely. You loved according to the capacity you had. You tried, you learned, you hurt, you grew. Their response may tell you something about their capacity. It cannot determine your worth. And yet, understanding their initial relief may help you stop panicking when you do not see the reaction you expected. For someone who experiences intimacy as pressure, distance can reduce immediate activation. No difficult conversation, no need to explain, no expectation to reassure, no fear of disappointing you in real time, no demand to confront emotions they may not understand themselves. Suddenly life feels simpler. They may work more, exercise more, socialize more, clean the house, start projects, spend time with friends, watch endless entertainment, throw themselves into routine. And you may look at all of this from a distance and think, how can somebody become more alive after losing me? But productivity can mean many things. Sometimes it is health, sometimes it is distraction, sometimes it is simply routine, sometimes it is a way of staying away from internal discomfort. You cannot know without genuine communication. So do not turn their behavior into a story designed to hurt you, and do not turn it into a story designed to comfort you either. Stay with what you actually know. There was a pattern. The pattern hurt you. You repeatedly tried to repair it. Now you are no longer automatically repairing it. That is enough information for this moment. Because something changes when enough time passes. At first, your silence can fit inside the old story. They are upset. They need time. They will reach out eventually. They always do. This is temporary. The mind loves familiar explanations. If you disappeared for 3 days before, 3 days means nothing. If you made it a week before contacting them last time, the first week may still fit the expected pattern. Even 2 weeks might be interpreted as another emotional pause if the relationship has survived similar gaps. But time keeps moving, and the familiar interruption does not come. Morning. Night, another morning, another weekend. A moment happens that you normally would have shared with them. Still nothing. A date passes that might have given you an excuse to reach out. Still nothing. Maybe they post something you would normally react to. Nothing. Maybe they leave some small opening. Still, you do not rush through it. And slowly, the silence changes category. It stops feeling like an event. It starts feeling like a new reality. That is a very different experience, because temporary silence contains assumption of return. Reabsence contains uncertainty, and uncertainty is where the old prediction begins to weaken. They knew how the previous story went. They do not know how this one goes. That does not mean panic begins. Do not reduce a complicated human being to a dramatic reaction. It means the mind receives new information. The person who usually restores contact has not restored it. The expected behavior has not occurred. Something is different. Maybe they notice it consciously. Maybe they simply feel that the rhythm has changed. Maybe they check your profile. Maybe they do not. Maybe they wonder. Maybe they push the thought away. Maybe nothing happens for a while. But the old certainty no longer has the same evidence supporting it. And there is something powerful about that. Not because you are controlling them, but because reality is finally being allowed to speak without your intervention. Before, your messages may have interrupted reality. Every time the relationship reached the point where both people would have to face the consequences of the pattern, you stepped in. You softened it. You reopened the door. You gave another chance. You created another bridge. You made it possible to continue without fully confronting what had happened. Again, that came from love. But love can sometimes protect people from information they need. If every withdrawal is followed by your pursuit, they never fully experience what withdrawal creates. And you never fully experience whether they would repair the rupture without being prompted. Now both truths are being allowed to emerge. This is why consistency matters more than dramatic declarations. You could send them a paragraph saying, "I am done chasing you." They might believe it, they might not. They might have heard similar words during previous conflicts. Words can become part of the cycle too, but when your behavior quietly changes, there is nothing to debate. You are simply no longer doing what you used to do. No announcement, no punishment, no performance. The bridge is no longer being rebuilt automatically. And now the relationship has to reveal whether somebody else is willing to walk toward the middle. This may be one of the hardest moments for you because your mind will try to interfere. It will say, maybe they are waiting for me too. Maybe both of us are being stubborn. Maybe somebody has to be mature. Maybe I should send one final message. And sometimes, depending on the relationship, a clear final conversation can absolutely be healthy. Silence is not automatically wisdom. Communication is not automatically chasing. Context matters. But if you have already communicated your needs clearly, already attempted repair repeatedly, already asked for consistency, and the same cycle keeps returning, another message may not contain new information. It may simply restart the familiar sequence. That is the question to ask. Am I communicating something new? Or am I trying to make an old pattern hurt less? There is a difference. One comes from clarity. The other often comes from anxiety, and only you can be completely honest about which one is speaking. Midway through this silence, you may experience a strange reversal. At the beginning, you were counting the hours. Then you stopped counting. At first, every notification made your heart jump. Then some notifications arrive, and you do not immediately think of them. At first, mornings begin with their absence. Then one morning you realize you thought about breakfast first. It seems insignificant. It is not. Your attention is returning to you. Little pieces of your life begin coming home. Music becomes music again instead of a collection of memories. A weekend becomes time instead of a test of whether they contact you. Your phone becomes an object instead of an emotional monitor. You start laughing without wondering whether they will ever hear that laugh again. You start making decisions that have nothing to do with whether they return. And this can create a strange grief, because healing sometimes means losing the version of the future you kept protecting. You may not only be grieving them, you may be grieving who you thought they would become. The conversation you believed would finally happen. The apology you thought would arrive. The relationship you believed was hiding underneath the confusion. The version of them that appeared in beautiful moments and disappeared whenever closeness became difficult. Hope can be harder to release than a person, because hope has no final message. It can survive almost anything. You can feed it with memories, with possibilities, with attachment theory, with signs, with dreams. with one sentence they said 6 months ago, with the way they looked at you once, with the idea that someday they will understand, and perhaps they will. But your life cannot remain suspended until somebody else reaches an emotional realization. That is where silence becomes sacred. Not because silence itself is magical, because it creates enough space for you to hear how much of your life had been waiting. And once you hear that, something inside you may refuse to go back to sleep. Still, there is another layer, because while your nervous system may slowly begin settling, the person who initially experienced distance as relief can eventually encounter something different. The pressure may be gone, but so is your presence. At first, those two things can feel like the same gift. Later, they may not, because your presence was not only pressure, you were also familiarity, attention, a voice, a routine, a source of emotional connection. Maybe you were the person who noticed the small things. Maybe you remembered details. Maybe you knew how their mood changed before they admitted anything was wrong. Maybe you celebrated things other people overlooked. Maybe you made ordinary days feel less ordinary. When somebody wants distance, the mind can focus heavily on the pressure associated with closeness. Distance removes the pressure, but with enough time, distance also removes the benefits of closeness. And those two realities do not always arrive emotionally at the same moment. This is where delayed processing becomes important. Some people feel separation immediately. Their emotions rush forward. They cry, they call friends, they replay everything. They cannot focus. The loss arrives all at once. Other people respond by organizing, working, distracting, explaining, rationalizing. They tell themselves it was for the best. They focus on incompatibilities. They remember the arguments. They emphasize everything that made closeness difficult. This can help create emotional distance, and sometimes that distance is exactly what they need. But feelings do not always follow the schedule we expect. A memory can return later. A song, a restaurant, a phrase, a Sunday afternoon that used to include you, a joke that nobody else understands. Something happens and their first impulse is to tell you. Then they remember. You are no longer there in the same way. That moment can be small, almost invisible. But absence is often understood through ordinary moments, not dramatic ones. You do not always miss someone at midnight in the rain. Sometimes you miss them at 2 in the afternoon because something funny happened and your hand almost reached for the phone. That is where loss can become real. But be careful. This is where hope can trick you again, because hearing that someone may process feelings later can become another reason to wait. You think, this is it, soon they will understand, soon the memories will hit, soon the relief will fade, soon they will realize. Maybe, maybe not. Your healing cannot depend on that timeline. And even if they miss you deeply, there is a truth more important than missing. Someone can miss your presence while still lacking the capacity to protect the relationship that presence created. Hold on to that, because it can save you from confusing emotion with transformation. Missing you is a feeling. Repair requires behavior. Regret is a feeling. Accountability requires behavior. Loneliness is a feeling. Commitment requires behavior. Desire is a feeling. Consistency requires behavior. Someone can experience enormous emotion and still repeat the same relational pattern. This is why a return alone proves very little. People return for many reasons. They miss familiarity. They feel lonely. They are curious whether you still care. Another connection disappointed them. They feel guilty. They genuinely reflected. They want comfort. They finally understand what happened. All of these possibilities exist. A message cannot tell you which one is true. Time and behavior can. That is why your silence cannot be merely a countdown until contact. If all you are doing is waiting for their return, your life is still organized around them. You are physically silent, but emotionally standing at the same door. Every morning you check whether the handle moved. Every night you wonder whether tomorrow is the day. Every piece of attachment advice becomes a prediction. Every passing week becomes evidence. You have stopped messaging, but you have not stopped chasing internally. And this is where the spiritual pivot begins. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why are you silent? Not the answer you would give publicly. The private answer. Are you silent because you finally understand that the cycle cannot continue? Or are you silent because you believe absence will make them chase you? Are you protecting your peace or testing their love? Are you creating space to heal or creating space so they feel your loss? Are you releasing the outcome or trying to control the outcome without speaking? Those differences matter because silence can be a boundary. Silence can be emotional regulation, silence can be avoidance, silence can also become punishment. The absence of words does not automatically make a behavior healthy. Intent matters, context matters, the pattern matters. If someone uses silence to frighten, punish, control, or force another person to surrender, that is very different from stepping away from a cycle that repeatedly harms you. Healthy space says, I cannot keep participating in this dynamic. Punitive silence says, I want you to suffer until you give me what I want. From the outside, both can look quiet. Inside, they are completely different. Do not skip this part because your healing depends on understanding it. You do not need to become emotionally unavailable to recover from someone else's emotional unavailability. You do not need to copy their withdrawal. You do not need to become cold. You do not need to pretend you stopped caring. You can care and still step away. You can love and still maintain a boundary. You can wish them well and still decide that access to you requires consistency. You can miss them and still refuse to repeat a pattern. That is maturity, not emotional numbness, not revenge, choice. Maybe you are still checking whether they viewed your story. Maybe you post something and secretly wonder whether they will react. Maybe you count the days. Maybe you know exactly how long it has been since the last message. Maybe you are waiting for their birthday because it gives you a socially acceptable reason to break the silence. Maybe you watch their online status. Maybe you look at who they follow. Maybe you rehearse your response for the message that has not arrived. If that is happening, do not shame yourself. Just notice what it means. Part of you is still connected to the outcome. Externally, you stopped running. Internally, you may still be chasing. And that inner chase can be more exhausting because nobody else can see it. You wake up tired from conversations that happened only in your mind. You argue with them mentally. You explain yourself perfectly. You imagine their apology. You imagine rejecting them. You imagine forgiving them. You imagine them with somebody else. You imagine them realizing nobody understood them like you did. Your body reacts to events that have not even happened. This is why detachment is not simply the absence of contact. Detachment is the gradual release of the need to control what the absence produces. That takes time. It is not a switch. Some days you will feel powerful. Some days you will miss them so deeply that every insight disappears. Some days you will think you are completely healed, and then a tiny reminder will reopen everything. Healing does not become false because pain returns. A wave does not mean you are back at the beginning. You are learning to experience emotion without turning every emotion into action. That is one of the most important changes a person can make. And eventually the question shifts. At first you ask, do they miss me? Then you ask, why do I need them to? At first you ask, will they return? Then you ask, would their return actually be good for me? At first you ask, how do I make them realize my value? Then you ask, why did I need someone else's realization before I honored my own value? That is when silence begins becoming real inside you too. Not just outside. You are no longer waiting to win. You are beginning to release the game. And this is where the hardest withdrawal begins. Because maybe you were never only attached to the person. Maybe you were attached to the pattern, the anticipation, the uncertainty, the emotional high when they returned, the relief when the coldness suddenly became warmth, the feeling that you had finally broken through their walls, the hope that this time the closeness would stay. When that cycle ends, peace can feel strangely empty. You may expect healing to feel beautiful. Sometimes it feels boring. There is no dramatic message, no emotional reunion, no sudden rush of relief. Just morning, breakfast, work, evening, sleep. Your nervous system, accustomed to emotional weather, may not immediately recognize calm as safety. Chaos was intense. Intensity felt meaningful. Uncertainty kept you alert. Relief felt euphoric. Now nothing is happening. And a part of you may whisper, maybe I should reach out. Not because the relationship became healthier, because the silence feels unfamiliar. This is why people sometimes return to painful patterns, even after understanding them. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar peace. You know how the pain works. You know your role. You know how to chase. You know how to repair. You know how to wait. But peace asks you to become someone new. Someone who does not need emotional chaos to feel connected. Someone who can tolerate a quiet phone. Someone who does not interpret consistency as boring. Someone who does not need to earn affection by surviving confusion. Someone who understands that being chosen inconsistently can hurt more than being released completely. That transformation can feel like losing part of your identity. Because perhaps for a long time you were the understanding one, the patient one, the one who stayed, the one who saw through their defenses, the one who believed in the person underneath the withdrawal. There was meaning in that role. It made you feel loyal, deep, different, maybe even spiritually connected to them. But there is a question waiting beneath that identity. Who are you when you are no longer rescuing the connection? That question can create emptiness, and emptiness can become sacred when you stop rushing to fill it. Sometimes life removes your ability to repeat a pattern before your heart fully understands why the pattern had to end. Maybe that is where you are. You still love them. You still do not completely understand. You still have questions. But something in you simply cannot go back to doing what you did before. Your mind might negotiate. Your heart might ache. Yet your hands remain still. Not because you hate them. Because something deeper has finally become tired of abandoning itself. And grief comes with that awakening. You grieve the person. You grieve the possibility. You grieve the version of yourself who waited so faithfully. You may even grieve the chase itself, because the chase gave your days a strange sense of purpose. There was always something to solve, something to analyze, something to hope for. When the chase ends, you meet yourself without the distraction. That can be frightening, because now you have to ask questions that have nothing to do with them. What do I want my life to feel like? What kind of love allows my body to rest? Why did uncertainty feel so familiar to me? Why was I willing to negotiate needs that actually mattered? What parts of myself became smaller to keep this connection comfortable? Where did I learn that love must be earned through endurance? You may not have answers yet. You do not need them immediately. Sometimes the right question changes a life long before the answer arrives. And slowly, the person they expected begins changing. They expected the person who needed closure from them. You start creating closure through what you observe. They expected the person who would explain one more time. You begin realizing that being understood cannot be forced. They expected the person who would accept mixed signals because losing them felt unbearable. You begin seeing that losing your peace was unbearable too. They expected the person who monitored every emotional shift. You begin giving that attention back to yourself. Your mornings start belonging to you again. This happens quietly. One day you wake up and reach for water before the phone. One day you go several hours without wondering whether they will contact you. One day someone mentions something related to them and your body does not collapse inside. One day you remember a beautiful moment without turning it into a reason to return. One day you realize that you still care, but the caring no longer controls you. That is growth, not forgetting, not becoming cold, not proving that you never needed them. You did need things. Connection, reassurance, consistency, love. Those needs were human. Growth means you stop asking one unavailable person to become the sole judge of whether those needs deserve to exist. And this is where attachment becomes hopeful. Attachment tendencies are not prison sentences. People can change. Avoidant people can become more secure. Anxious people can become more secure. Relationships can become healthier when both people develop awareness, communication, emotional regulation, and a willingness to behave differently. Life experiences can reshape how people relate. Healthy relationships can reshape expectations. Therapy can help some people recognize patterns they could not previously see. Self-awareness can create choice where there used to be automatic reaction, but change requires participation. You cannot heal another person's attachment pattern by becoming perfectly patient. You cannot love someone into self-awareness, and you cannot become secure by pretending you have no needs. Security is not needing nothing. Security is being able to honor your needs without abandoning yourself or controlling somebody else. It is saying, I care about you, and this dynamic does not work for me. It is being willing to communicate without begging. It is allowing another person to choose without making their choice a verdict on your worth. It is recognizing when compassion has become self-erasure. The greatest consequence of your silence may not be what happens inside them. It may be who begins appearing inside you. A calmer person, a clearer person, someone less impressed by words and more attentive to patterns, someone who no longer confuses being wanted with being valued, someone who understands that chemistry is beautiful, but consistency is sacred, someone who knows that another person's wounds deserve compassion, but do not automatically deserve unlimited access, someone who can finally look at the connection without asking only, how much do I love them? You also ask, how does this love affect me? That is a powerful question. Because love can be real and still be unsustainable. Two people can care and still be incompatible. A person can have beautiful qualities and still lack the emotional capacity required for the relationship you need. You do not have to turn someone into a villain before you are allowed to leave a painful cycle. That realization can set you free from years of inner argument. You do not need evidence that they are terrible. You need honesty about whether the relationship is healthy for you. And if they finally reach out, that honesty becomes essential. Because maybe one evening, after all this silence, your phone lights up. Their name appears. Your body recognizes it before your mind catches up. For 1 second, every lesson disappears. Maybe the message is almost painfully ordinary. Hey, or how have you been? Maybe they react to something you posted. Maybe they send an inside joke. Maybe they ask a practical question they could probably have answered without you. Maybe they say they were thinking about you. Maybe the message is longer. Maybe there is an apology. Maybe there is finally some acknowledgement of what happened, and suddenly the question you spent weeks asking has an answer. They reached out. But now another question begins. A more important one. Why? This is where the old version of you and the changing version of you may pull in opposite directions. The old version sees the name and feels relief. They came back. I mattered. They missed me. Maybe this can work. The changing version notices something else. A message is information. It is not transformation. Contact proves contact, nothing more. You need to hear that because hope can turn a tiny gesture into an entire future within seconds. They say hello and your mind imagines reconciliation. They say they miss you and your heart imagines change. They apologize and you begin rebuilding the relationship before you know whether their behavior can support the apology. Slow down, not to punish them, to protect clarity. Ask yourself what is actually different. Are they communicating clearly? Not vaguely. Not sending a breadcrumb and waiting for you to perform the rest of the emotional labor. Clearly. Are they willing to acknowledge what happened? Can they hear how the pattern affected you without immediately defending themselves? Do they take responsibility for their part? Do they ask about your experience? Can they tolerate the discomfort of a real conversation? Or do they want immediate warmth without addressing the rupture? Are their actions consistent after the emotional moment passes? Because anyone can become vulnerable for one evening. Change reveals itself in patterns. Does communication remain steady next week? Can they express a need for space without disappearing? Can they return from space when they say they will? Can you express a need without feeling ashamed? Can both people repair instead of assigning one person the permanent role of repairer? Are you building something new or reopening something familiar? These questions matter because missing someone does not automatically create emotional maturity. Regret does not automatically create accountability. Loneliness does not automatically create readiness, and wanting access to you does not automatically mean someone has learned how to care for that access. Someone can miss your presence while still lacking the capacity to protect the relationship that presence created. That truth becomes your anchor, because maybe they genuinely miss you, maybe they cried, maybe they thought about you constantly, maybe your silence finally reached a place inside them that your explanations never reached. Even then, emotion alone is not enough. The question is not only, do they feel? The question is, what can they do with what they feel? Can they turn awareness into communication? Can they turn regret into responsibility? Can they turn desire into consistency? Can they remain emotionally present after the fear of losing you disappears? That last question matters more than almost anything, because some people become intensely available when they sense you leaving. Then once they feel secure that you are staying, the old distance returns. If that happens, the reunion did not break the cycle. It completed it again. They withdrew. You finally stopped pursuing. They sensed the loss. They returned. You felt relief. The relationship restarted, then safety returned for them. And so did the old pattern. That is why you cannot judge change by the intensity of the reunion. You judge it by what happens after the reunion stops feeling dramatic. Tuesday afternoon matters, the boring week matters, the first disagreement matters. The first moment when closeness feels uncomfortable again matters. Can both of you behave differently there? That is where change becomes real. Do not reward breadcrumbs simply because you were hungry. A starving heart can mistake crumbs for a feast. You waited so long for contact that any contact can feel enormous. But your standards should not shrink because your longing grew. A casual message can be welcome. It does not automatically deserve immediate emotional access. An apology can be meaningful. It does not erase the need for consistent behavior. A declaration of love can be sincere. It does not solve an attachment pattern by itself. A return is not reconciliation. Reconciliation is not repair. Repair requires change behavior. And maybe after everything you realize you do want to speak with them. That is allowed. Healing does not require permanent silence. It requires choice. You can respond because you genuinely want to, not because panic forces you. You can hear them without immediately surrendering every boundary. You can remain warm without becoming available for the old pattern. You can say, I care about you, but I need something different now. And if they cannot meet you there, you do not need another dramatic ending. Sometimes clarity is quiet. Sometimes you simply recognize that the person standing in front of you is still offering the same relationship you finally learned to stop accepting. That can hurt. But it hurts differently. Before, the pain said, please choose me. Now the pain says, I wish this could have been different, but I will not abandon myself to make it different. That is grief with dignity. And there is another possibility nobody prepares you for. They finally send the message you once prayed for. And when it arrives, you discover you no longer need it the way you thought you would. You read their name, you feel something. Of course you do. But the desperation is missing. The fantasy is quieter. You are not trying to turn 3 words into a lifetime. You are simply observing. And in that moment, you realize the silence changed more than the relationship. It changed the person receiving the message. You, the old you wanted the message to remove the pain. The changing you wants truth, even if truth means walking away. The old you wanted proof that you mattered. The changing you knows that your worth did not disappear because someone struggled to hold it. The old you wanted them back. The changing you asks whether back is even where you want to go. Because maybe going back is no longer the goal. Maybe the goal is forward. With them, if both people genuinely change. Without them, if they do not. Either way, forward. And that is where the deepest mystery of your silence begins to reveal itself. You thought the silence was testing whether they could live without you. But perhaps it was showing you whether you could finally live without abandoning yourself. You thought you were waiting to see whether they would choose you. But perhaps life was waiting to see whether you would choose yourself when nobody else was there to reassure you. And once that choice becomes real, their return can no longer have the same power over you. Because the next question is no longer whether they will come back. The next question is what happens when they come back and discover that the person they expected to find is no longer waiting in the same place. And what happens after that is where everything changes. Maybe the deepest truth in all of this is that your silence was never really about whether they would notice it. At the beginning, silence meant no message, no call, no checking in, no attempt to repair the distance. You were watching the days pass and wondering when they would realize something had changed. But now you can see it differently. Your silence became real when you stopped using it to create a reaction. It became real when you stopped checking whether it was working. It became real when their curiosity stopped mattering more than your peace. It became real when you stopped bargaining with your own boundaries just because you missed them. And it became real when you finally accepted the hardest possibility of all. They may come back, they may not. Neither outcome gets to decide your worth anymore. That is the transformation. You started this journey asking, will they reach out? But maybe the better question now is, who am I becoming now that I no longer need them to? Because some connections return transformed. Some return exactly the same. Some return only long enough to test whether the old door is still open, and some never return at all. But none of those endings require you to abandon yourself again. You do not need to become cold. You do not need to pretend you never cared. You do not need to erase every memory or convince yourself that the connection meant nothing. You can honor what you felt and still choose something healthier. You can miss someone and still move forward. You can love someone and still recognize that love alone cannot carry a relationship. And you can forgive someone without reopening a cycle that cost you your peace. Before you go, hold on to this one last thing, because it may be the most important part of everything you heard here. The silence was never supposed to teach them your value. It was supposed to give you enough stillness to remember it yourself. Everything you have heard through this journey may feel new, but somewhere deep inside, part of you already knew. You just needed the noise to become quiet enough to hear it. So if they return, meet them from clarity. If they do not, keep walking from clarity. Either way, do not return to the version of yourself who believed love had to be chased to be real. Your life is still moving. Your heart is still learning, And the peace you are building now may become worth far more than the message you once waited for. If this spoke to something real inside you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Not for an algorithm. Do it because there may be another moment ahead when you need this kind of reminder again. And when that moment comes, I hope you remember this. You were never waiting for them to choose you. You were learning how to choose yourself.